that energy out.
That's right. You picked the right talk to come to, people.
All right. Cool. Yeah, so welcome to our talk, which is Oops. We knew you named it wrong. No, it was you.
You. I'm so positive you named it wrong. Hi, I am Melissa. I'm an engineer at Applied VR, where we're solving pain through immersive therapeutics. I've been in the naming game long enough to know that sometimes I've done it well and with wicked clever names, and other times, well, I've tripped up and left some pretty smelly names behind. I met Ian at one of these gigs.
Yeah, I'm Ian, and I currently am a manager at BackerKit doing crowdfunding work, but we worked with Melissa at some doing pair programming and, making questionable decisions, but sometimes, that's what you got to do. And sometimes being like, hey, I'm going to make that change, and I'm going to go have fun. So yeah, and shout out to Winnie, my cat. She's great, and my manager, so very important. Yeah, and so before we really go into it, something really important is like, why is a bad name versus a good name important? And like, do we just make bad names? Do we just like wake up in the morning and like, I'm just gonna throw something out there because I'm just being a developer? You do. Okay, maybe I do, but I don't think that's how most people think, right? Most people are trying to be rational, and I think a great example of this actually has to do with. So you at BackerKit, right? It's a crowdfunding platform. You raise money for a very set period of time, and so you might so the project goes live for a very specific amount of time. They might think, oh, okay, cool. This is just some kind of before action that makes sure that the project is live before you can do anything.
Or does it?
But the important thing is there's other context. So it turns out that in addition to a project being live on Kickstarter or BackerKit, it can also be live on Kickstarter. I just mixed it up because there's two different places it could be live. So what does being live mean? And you can see developers struggle with that. My favorite scope right there, live and open on Pledge Manager. Somebody's trying to be very specific because there's a very complicated topic hiding there, but it's kind of not really telling you the ambush of like, it turns out you can have a project be live, but then it can also be closed. So is it alive or dead? I don't know.
And you're double live there, Ian, because you're live where, and open on Pledge Manager.
Yeah. So I think it's important to understand, to have that developer empathy that like what makes names tricky is that they evolve over time. And they're localized to a specific context. I think you've got another similar example, don't you, Melissa?
Yeah. As anyone joining a new company does, you spend a little time. You're splunking around under the code, and you're like, hey, what is this?
Somebody really liked enums. I love enums, right?
I mean, Ian, I thought I knew what an enum was. Isn't it an attribute with values that map to integers in the database that can be queried by name, right? I'm just so confused by this name, and that's exactly the pitfall of naming gone wrong. Context. What do messy names do? It makes you have bad assumptions, right? It causes wasted time trying to understand a clever name that someone left behind. And I swear, I'm sure someone thought they were super clever when they created this controller for me that spit out daily tips under the name of enum. So don't create a walled garden between those who know and those who don't.
And I think it's really important. I would love, what does somebody think a project being legit is?
Well, I don't know. Isn't that an MC Hammer song, like Too Legit to Quit? Did somebody there like MC Hammer?
Maybe with Kickstarter, maybe it's like the project is legal, so we have a legal team review, and it's like legit.
No? Still no?
And actually, in fun context, what that actually means is when the first developer on the team, I won't name names, when they were able to successfully take that project from Kickstarter and put it onto our platform, it was legit because it worked.
As for me, I found this lovely, lovely variable waiting for me in a controller, and it told me what kind of record type it was.
Yeah, it's a join record. Done.
Hooray! Thank you. How about what I'm going to do with it? Wouldn't it have made a little more sense to maybe just going to throw this out here? It said, existing order device or something a little descriptive, something that's going to leave a breadcrumb for the future. Because what this left for me was, oh snap, am I missing some context? Is there some reason that it was really important that they named it this and left it in the code? What am I missing?
Maybe they're, following the old, that old syntax, like _I, _join.
I'm going to name everything I, X, and P.
And so we want to kind of set the stage by, we both worked at, as mentioned before, we both worked at a medical healthcare company, and we tried to, be a little bit better, like try and take some of those things that are growing over time and see what we could do to make it better. And so we're going to walk you through some examples.
And like Ian said, we felt it was important that you have this background because it really does set the stage. We spent an inordinate amount of time writing tests filled with catty test data and debugging with puts meow. But then,
Sometimes checked in.
Yeah, sometimes. Not always, I promise. We had linters. We fixed them when we got those through. The company was originally treating people for a single medical condition, prediabetes. Eventually, as with any good business, right, it grew, it changed, and we ultimately increased the number of treatable conditions. The increase in scope and complexity of treatments meant the app changed, like a lot. It still maintains to this day a monolith at its core, but now there are several smaller applications, microservices, and custom
I love
gems.
those.
Yes, he does, to support the business model, as well as several integration with third parties. Understanding where one app began and another ended was complex, and handling large-scale renames was delicate work. Both Ian and I led or supported many rename and refactor efforts, learning some really painful lessons along the way where we were heard muttering, oh well, if that was the nicest thing we said, and oops, we named that one wrong.
Cool. So I've got a fun little story, and it has some good and bad endings to it. So we're going to start with something these health coaches would message our participants, and it turns out if you were engaged, you might be more willing to learn how to get better health outcomes. So it turns out that the data science team would start making these suggestions that would be like, hey, at this time and day, you should go talk to them, and it would help improve their health outcomes. And that was great because the business is working. But then there was a bit of a problem. They stopped being suggestions and more like mandates from the business. So
No, I'm pretty sure that's what they called them.
Probably under the hood. And so the business started to stop using the word suggestion and wanted to stop using the word suggestion because of the political nature of that. And so they started to call them outreach prompts because the coaches are outreaching to a specific participant. And so I was asked, my manager asked me, hey, good domain-driven design, we should be moving with the business. Let's just start with, boom, okay, let's just rename suggestions to outreach prompts.
Ian, that never ends well.
Well, hey, spoilers. It started out, I was on the coaching team at the time, and so it started okay, because, we received suggestions from the data science app, and we spit those over to the data warehouse so that you can do the machine learning doodads. And so, at first it's okay to be great, now the coaching app has outreach prompts, hooray! But it turns out that the data warehouse still needed to have the data taken in as suggestions, especially because, DIY startup, so we're not so much a data warehouse as is foreign data wrappers, kind of grabbing the data from the databases directly. And so it actually caused when I shipped that code, it actually caused the data warehouse to be broken for a bit because it wasn't able to pull in the data. Oops. And actually, Winnie, I went to Winnie, and then Winnie suggested that I introduce a translation layer. I make it someone else's problem. And so it turns out I was able to make a suggestion, a contribution to the data warehouse where the foreign data wrapper actually, that name suggestions, actually it's outreach prompts, and then pulls that data in. So I'm done at least, right? Do you know if they actually renamed suggestions elsewhere yet?
Yeah, it sort of became the next evolution of, I believe, your good friend, the recommended topic.
Oh yeah, so and that's actually kind of another funny thing, which is, oh no, changed again. So it turns out the business also wanted to have ways that weren't using data science, like using some kind of random trigger, like, let's talk to them on their birthday, for example. And so actually kind of like the code's still evolving. And so obviously the moral of that story is, oh, come on. Oops, I jumped the slide. But that kind of speaks to the difficulty of external interfaces, right? Like when you're dealing with other providers, a rename actually and a refactor isn't as easy as just like replacing it, because you actually have to watch out for those external interfaces. Another place I get got all the time is like, I'm like, this controller name never stopped making sense. Well, I actually have to go double check if any emails are talking to it, because like those links are held on to forever, ever, all men, so that's unfortunate. But yes, so yeah, just, it'll never just don't rename anything, right? That's the moral of the story, right?
Nope, that's not the answer either. Now, Ian, that doesn't mean it won't be complicated and sometimes disheartening. Remember that perfectionism is the enemy of good enough. As your story illustrated, sometimes we don't reach the anticipated end or the goal. It changes and we get to rename to a good enough state. And you did. You got us to recommended topics. And I'll never forgive you for the birthday topic.
Well, just forget bleep years. It's fine. It's fine.
You want to pop us to the next slide?
Yeah. So I think Melissa has also a story where she actually made it a bit further than I did.
I do. My story had an original stated end goal, and believe it or not, we did get to the end goal. So let me tell you about it. When we started, each participant was a member of a group, and that group had a coach assigned, thus creating a many participants to one coach relationship. We love those, right? All the participants were treated for the same condition, prediabetes, and were on a 16-week journey towards learning how to live with their disease and improve their quality of life. Then, as we mentioned before, the business expanded.
Yeah, because we solved that problem, right?
Yes, we did. You should come see that unnamed healthcare company. We moved into new conditions like type 1 and type 2 diabetes and hypertension, to name a few. These new conditions weren't going to come on a 16-week journey anywhere. They were going to come and be a part of our program for an indefinite amount of time in many instances. Initially, we came up with some workarounds, some really nifty hacks to the system that allowed us to provide members care, but we knew these were not long-term solutions, and we knew there was a lot of technical debt that had to be paid off in order to make the app sustainable and move forward, right? So here I am in the thick of things, and my manager comes and says, hey, Melissa, how would you like to handle this rename refactor feature? And I said, sure. Then he said, wait, let me tell you about the requirements. And I was like, oh, I should have said no. How many of you have done that? And he told me, he goes, you can't have any breaking changes, nothing. No downtime, no breaking changes, support multiple condition, allow multiple specialists to interact with members, track the specialist assignments, continue to schedule health coach vacations, and add specialist vacations. This last one was a really big deal because our specialists had to reach out based on those recommended topics and insights Ian mentioned before, where type 1 and type 2 members tracked high glucose levels or high blood pressure and then they had to be responded to within a specified amount of time. So the topic pops up, the coach has X amount of time to respond. Well, that's a paradigm shift for us because as you can see here, we were moving to this model with the member at the center.
I love many-to-many relationships.
Yeah, it's great. So while we did have an entire quarter to execute on this overall architectural change, there was some initial work that had to be done in about 4 weeks because almost all of the rest of the work was blocked on these changes. So for 4 weeks, myself and another engineer went to the little code mines and we expanded scopes and renamed columns and models to reshape the code base to make room for this expanded business model. So what I did was I picked one of the models that had a ton of change.
I love diagrams.
So yeah, I do too, because it was the only way I could keep all my thoughts straight. So this model didn't just get a rename of some columns and some add of new columns. The whole table went through a rename, which is a really big deal when you cannot have any downtime. So in order to make this play nicely, and also change some very basic concepts of our company, one of the things that we did was we started with this initial model, the care team model, or I'm sorry, the coach assignment, where you can see there was a participant, there was a coach ID, and in this we were metamorphizing the names too. We were going to staff, we were going to member. So what we did was that we found that by bringing columns up in parallel, by dual writing, thank you Strong Migrations for reminding me of so many of these little tidbits, we were able to expand the model, alias the model. And then we were able to move the constraints from the initial columns where they existed over to the new columns. And then, very slowly, as we watched it play out in production and we saw that we had things going where they needed to be, we were able to begin to drop the old columns slowly, quietly, just get them down and get them out of the way. But we were able to do this, and this was but one of the models that we had to rename during that period. And I'm not going to lie, it was a little nerve-wracking. And one of the other major changes that happened here is we repurposed the role column. Rather than rename it, we got rid of the concept of primary and covering for coach assignments. We renamed those to actually what the people were. So, like I said, I learned some really valuable lessons and sort of started calling it the rename dance, as you can see here. This is how I approach it. Even today, in the work that I do, it might be on a smaller scale, I still run through my rename dance. And I ask myself, do I need to do this? Maybe not. Maybe I can be a little bit quicker. Maybe I can skip, or I can do two of them at one time. But as Ian and I both really enjoy the gem, Strong Migrations, it is there to remind you of the right thing to do at the right time when renaming columns and or renaming tables.
I mean, having to deploy between each of those steps seems kind of obnoxious. Can't I just, just call tweet that we're going to be down for 20 minutes?
Yeah, not so much. Most people like to have that uptime, right? I don't know about you, but I kind of like to know that my app is up and running. So when you deploy changes in a blue-green environment, right? One of them's got it, one of them doesn't. And there is that moment in between where you can cause errors and wreak a little havoc in your own app. Why? Why? Just follow the rename dance, right? Avoid some complexity, avoid some problems. Make your life a little bit easier, right?
When you have a new table, sometimes you can skip it, I feel.
That is 1,000% true. If you want to rename something that's really small, that only ever gets written to a few times, the chances of it being a problem of just going whole hog in with the active record, rename me migration, is not going to hurt you. It's, always a gamble, but chances are that you can just go ahead and follow along with that in those instances. And there's one other reason, Ian. Why would we not want to just rename a table? Don't we have some friends and they live on that team called Data?
Yeah, they can deal with it later.
If you want to do yourself a solid favor, let your data team, your data science, your data warehouse people know that this is coming. The rename dance provides you the grace period to do that. It allows them to be proactive in their approach to what is happening rather than coming to you, knocking on your table and being super reactive and calling you a lot of bad cat names.
Speaking of smell, or actually that wasn't names. Anyways, so yeah, I feel like another important thing to kind of point out is I think that with a name being not totally fitting the right thing, it's kind of a tool in the box, which kind of can give you a hint toward you trying to rename it can give you a hint. Maybe you don't need to rename it, but you do need, that does give you a refactoring tool. Let's talk about a friend of mine here. So we have this class called Stripe Customer Updater, and you start reading through the class, and you're like, okay, it takes somebody's new credit card information, and it takes it from Stripe, and it stores it on order. Straightforward enough. But then you notice that at the end of the code, there's a retry payment line that turns out that it's actually going to do two things. It's actually going to update that person's credit card and then charge it again. And your first instinct might be to do that. Just rename it to that nice little blob over there.
Did you
done.
Seriously go from Stripe Customer Updater to Stripe Customer Updater and Order Charger?
Hey, it's right now.
Oh,
No.
I think you already know what I'm going to say about that name.
But you notice, like, right now we have that and. But even thinking about doing it that way, now you have that and now you can think, actually, well, maybe I'm missing a collaborator object who's responsible for talking to those two different responsibilities, updating your credit card and charging the credit card. And maybe that needs to be talking and collaborating where a Stripe Customer Updater was previously collaborating. And so that can so I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to think about what the name is and then being like, okay, I don't want to live here, so what's the next step after that?
Oh, again, new code base. I find all kinds of really fun, interesting things, like that somebody named one of our tables files. That's not problematic at all, right?
You can just overload what the file means on class, right?
Yeah, that seems like super the way I want to go. No, not even. I mean, thankfully, they were kind enough to at least alias it and give me the S3 file. Do I love this solution? No. But again, the enemy of good enough is perfectionism, right? So while I may not love this solution, this is a solution to get around the whole renaming game, right? Without going through the hellish landscape of possibly renaming a very, very large table that had a lot of records, right? So I can go type S3 file and I can make a new record. So maybe it's not always bad.
I mean, I think, well, the thing is, right, is that you still got to ship, and we still have to be delivering value. So I think sometimes being able to say, like, at least it's going to only affect 10% of what I'm doing if I'm happening to, like, talk to the tables directly, which, I mean, we're mostly just addicted to application or active record anyways, right? So hopefully that shouldn't be the case.
We have a
maybe.
database?
Yeah, so, like, hopefully that means at least 80% of your cases you're at least starting to think about the domain model and moving away from the fact that it's called files. And yeah, and hopefully at some point the next developer comes along, gets annoyed by it, and does the rest of it work for you. Yeah.
So let's talk about some lessons that we hope you can walk away from this talk today with. Ian, you want to hit our first one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think kind of a theme that we've been kind of hammering on is that perfectionism is the enemy of a good enough name. I think you do need to let that pain sit. You do need to if you move too fast, you're going to end up having to move again. But at the same time, like, you do want to be moving forward. So think about ways that you can kind of balance both of those things.
And be curious about your context, right? What is the contextual clues that you can use to understand the names that are there, the names that you're creating? They don't happen, as we said, in a vacuum. Also, there are smelly names, as we saw, right? Sometimes they tell us something. And even when you're naming, there's that aha moment where you go, oh, that name I just came up with tells me that I need to rename this now, and I need to rename it in thus and thus fashion, and I need to take on some other maybe refactors while I'm in here.
Yeah, because I think, right, like a bad name tends to be like I'm holding too many responsibilities, tends to be what a bad name is actually revealing. So figuring out what is the seam of that name and how can I re-divvy out the responsibilities and how do I 80-20 it? Like, what's going to help me get towards a more clear name without having to and what are the advantage points? Because of the external interfaces, you want to make sure maybe you don't change the universe, but you change enough of it so that it's easy to change the rest of it later.
But be mindful, external interfaces are the most tricky to rename. They're external for a reason. You often have partners that rely on them, other applications, other microservices, other gems. Those really are the most tricky, but they can be undertaken if you handle it with a iterative, clear approach and you're communicating.
Cool. I guess we're kind of fast on time, but that's good for y'all. Backercade is hiring. If you're interested in doing some interesting stuff in the crowdfunding namespace and pairing, come talk to me after. Also, I have a board game, so you should go check that out.
Shameless plug also for Applied VR. We're hiring. If you're interested, please reach out to me. We have a variety of roles that are available. And yeah, I think that is the end of our talk.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Because you named it wrong.
I guess we have time for questions, so anyone want to ask any questions?
The gentleman in the, oh, wait a minute. The gentleman in the back, I saw a hand with the red shirt.
You're stacked next. So the question was asked, like, so I think we didn't really cover what does a good name look like, and I think a good name, right? It gives you doesn't make you lose time, in my opinion, at least for me. Like helps you go in the right, like who are my collaborators? What is its responsibilities? And helps you kind of move in that direction. I don't know. What do you think, Melissa?
It's clear. It's contextual. We recently named something, we had a Faraday connection manager. There you go. Tells me what it's using, what it's doing, and where it sits, right? Single, it does a single job, so it should be descriptive. And that is why that whole notion of the enemy of good enough is perfectionism, right? I've spent way too much time thinking over really good names, and more than likely that first name you come up with is going to be close to the mark that you're looking for. Oh, I for real saw files. Like, yeah. What was the worst name that we've ever kind of come across? Yeah, files like ranked right up there. I just kind of sat there and looked at it for a good minute and thought, I gotta be missing something here. This can't be the name of a model. Like, oh my God, they really did. And then I actually went and asked the one engineer that was still there, and he goes, no, for real, go look at the migrations. We really did that. And I was like, oh, sweet baby Buddha, like, why? What about you, Ian?
Honestly, stuff like legit, I think, is usually what throws me off, because it's where it's blurry, and it's not even like blurry in a way that like helps me give a hint for what the person was thinking. Like I can usually have like sympathetic hints for like this they know the database like it drifted over time. Like you can see examples of like where the name probably made sense at the time and then it stopped making sense. But when it's examples like it made sense in that person's head, I guess I'm trying to be generous.
Or you name it after Greek characters.
Oh yeah, cute names too. Yeah, those are the worst. Yeah. So let me make sure I understand your question. Are you kind of saying that like, there are some people who say that having a good name is good, but that if you have the IDE and you can just hover and see the context, that it shouldn't matter what the name is because you can just like look at the IDE and see what it
There
says?
is a built-in assumption you have there, and I've worked with too many of them, and I believe we had a Vim example earlier today workshop, right? You have people who are not using IDEs and don't want to use IDEs. What do? Right? So we have to believe that we live in a world that we are making room for everybody regardless of the tools that they want to use. And to that end, that means name it just well enough. I don't need you to be perfect. Lily?
I would kind of say the Stripe customer updater example is a great one where that wouldn't tell you, because if the recharge code is buried way deep and then you start using it and then you don't realize that it's doing that side effect, that could very much, like you'd have to read the full context of that code just to understand that side effect is kind of hiding. Like I don't think the IDE would pop up and warn you that that's happening.
Skunkworks. No.
So I think there's two things. Let me read. I think everybody heard that question, but for the back, what do you do if you're finding the name is tough? It's tough for you, but everyone else has kind of accepted that name isn't so great. I would think I would try and make sure you understand. Like I think that there are names that are very costful, and there are names that do have a tax, but like aren't as annoying. Like for example, I mean, certainly this is all relative, so totally granted on that. Like at our current code base, we have an extra. In the database, it's called an extra, but on all the front-facing views, it's called an add-on. And they're like effectively the same words, in my opinion. So like there is a tax where you have to like make that mental translation, but it's not as annoying as other things. So, but that being said, you can still in seams like you can still start calling it out like your service objects can start be calling add-ons. You don't have to immediately move everything over to start like trying out a new name for size, which is another argument I was saying, which is like you can do incremental refactors to kind of experiment with names and see if it's actually something that and then they might, and by shipping it, then they might be like, oh yeah, actually that's kind of great that it's not that it is what it is.
We got
All right,
time.
I think we're out of time now.
We got time. Do we have time for one more?
I think we're at 0-0.
People are moving.
All right, if you have any other questions, just come up and talk to us.
Come talk to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.